It was the autumn of 1942, and Berlin's air already carried a hard edge. In a corridor of the High Command, a translated copy of a telegram from Norway moved from hand to hand until it reached an office where paper became policy. The message was not about a breakthrough at the front. It was a damage inventory from a seized shipyard, precision machine tools meant for submarine production destroyed by an explosion, a projected delay of 4 months, a list of serial numbers where there should have been intact steel. The file's category stamp sounded almost administrative in its calm, commando raid. The staff officer responsible for processing the file set aside the unit rotation table he had been updating. He opened a drawer and pulled out 2 other folders that had been waiting, like witnesses called in advance. One, from the French coast, described the communications blind spots that followed the destruction of a radar station. The other, from a channel port, listed the supply shortfalls after a fuel depot fire. Each report had the same shape: a small team, a sudden strike, and a loss far out of proportion to the number of attackers. He spread the 3 documents across his desk until they formed a crude map of vulnerability. Then he drew a fresh sheet of official stationery toward him and began a synopsis for the Chief of Staff. The pen's nib scratched in the quiet room. This was not a routine assessment of material loss. He wrote that these raids were asymmetric stabs at the nerves of war, aiming not to win a tactical exchange, but to systematically paralyze logistical capacity. Their target was not a platoon in the open. It was the infrastructure that kept whole divisions alive. He knew how a staff mind would receive the words. The higher the desk, the more war became a matter of charts and calendars. A commando raid, if described only as broken tools and delayed production, might be treated as an irritation. So he made the attack sound like what it was, a threat to the machinery itself. He wrote that the existing conventions of war, built for armies meeting under flags and recognizable formations, left a gap when confronted with small teams that struck deep behind lines, blended, withdrew, and left only smoke and paperwork. The synopsis went upstairs. Hours later, a verbal instruction came back down: draft a clear order on how such personnel were to be handled. At the front, units complained that the enemy arrived like ghosts and vanished before reprisals could be exacted. In Berlin, that anger became an empty space on a desk that had to be filled with words precise enough to be executed by strangers. The staff officer summoned a legal advisor. The door shut. They spoke less about the battlefield than about categories, because categories were how a system made violence durable. Their discussion revolved around definition and exclusion, the 2 hinges of any bureaucratic killing. The problem was how to use formal language to pull a group of people out of the protected class called prisoners of war. The advisor's caution was not mercy, it was technique. If the language was too broad, it would expose the command. If it was too narrow, it would fail to deter. The typewriter began to clack. The first draft was blunt and brutal, a statement of intent without a method. It was judged insufficiently operational. A commander needed to know what chain to use, what paperwork to file, and above all, how to prevent the ordinary channels of the prisoner of war system from absorbing the case and leaving records behind. The advisor kept returning to the same cold question: how do you make it automatic? Hours passed. Drafts were crumpled and thrown away. At last, a single line hardened into place: all those carrying out so-called commando missions are to be killed to the last man. The staff officer's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment after the sentence appeared. He could hear beyond the wall the muted rhythm of a building that never slept. Then he resumed typing. A core clause on its own was not yet a mechanism. It required supporting modules, definitions, transfer instructions, and threats meant to crush hesitation. The text grew additional limbs. A newly added paragraph stated that if such persons were captured by the military, they must be handed over immediately to the security service, and under no circumstances were they to be placed in a prisoner of war camp, not even for temporary holding. Another paragraph was added as a protective patch. The order did not apply to enemy troops captured in open, large-scale combat operations. The patch was not restraint, it was camouflage, meant to suggest that the command respected law, when in fact it was creating a hole in law large enough to swallow men. When the draft was complete, before it went for final signature, it was locked in a safe along the wall. Turning the key, the staff officer spoke quietly to the advisor beside him. as if the words could be left inside the metal with the paper. This, he said, would either be the tool to deal with ghosts, or it would become a noose for the men who wrote and carried it. On October 18, 1942, the order received its number, signature, and seal. Top-secret copies were split among several safes. Lower classified copies were placed in standard manila envelopes, the flaps stamped and sealed with wax. A courier collected the stack and walked out. The click of his shoes on the corridor marble thinned and disappeared. The order was no longer merely a set of sentences. It was a gear set into motion inside the machine, and the machine did not require belief, only compliance. It moved outward by levels. The highest copies remained locked away, accessible only to a few hands. The practical version traveled as instructions that would be spoken, summarized, and remembered. The system that drafted the order understood something about its own vulnerability. Paper could incriminate, so it tried to keep the paper rare while making the effect common. The envelopes left Berlin and moved outward to commands across occupied Europe. One arrived at a headquarters in occupied France. An officer responsible for operational directives signed for it and sent the adjutant away. Alone, he cut the wax with a paper knife and pulled out the thin pages. The title was Spare. The date was October 18, 1942. He lit a cigarette and read. He did not need long to find the center of gravity. Killed to the last man. Handed over immediately to the security service, not to be held as prisoners of war. The exception clause, attached like a patch, asserted that the order did not apply to troops taken in open, large-scale combat. And the closing line, aimed inward, promised punishment for any officer who hesitated. He read the phrases twice, not because they were unclear, but because they were too clear. The order did not merely authorize killing, it structured it. It contained an input condition and an output requirement. First, the captured man had to be defined as a commando. Then the military had to transfer him into a different apparatus. After that, the military could claim it had followed procedure, while the prisoner vanished from any military record. The cigarette burned down unnoticed between his fingers, the ash lengthening until it dropped onto the desk blotter. In his mind, the document broke into parts the way a mechanic breaks a device into modules. The first was definition, a net with wide holes, so-called commando missions. The second was execution, not described as a firing squad, but as a handoff, immediate transfer. The third was the exception clause, the pale scrap of legality that could be shown if anyone asked why a man in uniform had been killed. The fourth was the internal threat, aimed at German officers themselves, ensuring that obedience would be treated as self-preservation. He understood with professional clarity what the machine required from him. He did not have to pull a trigger. He had to install a process. The input label would be commando. The process step would be transfer to the security service. The output, though the order avoided describing it in detail, was eradication. The exception clause was the system's one thin line of defense when challenged, a shield made of paper held up against a grave. His task was not to debate. It was to implement, and the order itself anticipated resistance by limiting dissemination. The full text could not be circulated below a certain level. So a week later, he convened senior regimental and battalion commanders for an oral briefing in a sealed operations room. No paper was handed out. He recited the essentials from memory. The definition that would trigger the order, the requirement to transfer, the exception clause that pretended to limit the scope, and the warning that disobedience would be prosecuted under military law. When he finished, the room stayed silent. No one asked a question. The silence was not agreement, it was calculation. Each man was already imagining a night on a beach or a hut in a village, a patrol returning with bound prisoners, and the moment when a decision would have to be made faster than conscience could form a sentence. As the men filed out, one colonel lingered and let the door swing almost shut behind the last of the others. He lowered his voice, as if even walls could be charged. "If the men we capture are wearing standard British or American uniforms," he asked, "and they carry identification tags, but they are clearly on a sabotage mission, are they part of a large-scale operation, or do they become commandos under the order?" The officer met his colleague's eyes and felt the weight shift from paper to flesh. The question was not theoretical. The boundary was where the order wanted it, inside ambiguity. If the clause could be stretched, then any captured man who resembled a raider could be pulled into the exception. If it could not, the order's threat would collapse when challenged. The officer looked away and nodded toward the folder on his desk stamped "Secret." "The power to define is in the clauses," he said. "The responsibility to execute sits on our shoulders." After the briefing, he followed the procedure of secrecy. The highest classified copy, marked "Destroy" after reading, went into the shredder. Blades turned the pages into pale strips. Yet he could not shred the knowledge already lodged in living minds. He returned to his desk and wrote a few lines on a note card, the key points of the oral briefing stripped down to operational requirements. He slipped the note into a public file labeled "Current Operational Directives." The safe was empty. The desk was full. He went to the window. Outside lay his sector's coastline, a grey sea under a low sky. Allied raiders would keep coming, like shadows on the water. The order was no longer only a document. It was an activated program, waiting for an input it could recognize. In the spring of 1943, Norway's fjords remained cold. Before dawn, a German coastal patrol saw the dark outline of a rubber boat approaching, too small to be a fishing craft. The patrol set an ambush behind rocks. Two figures in dark clothing came ashore and hauled the boat into a cleft. They carried square packages and a wireless set, not rifles. At the lieutenant's signal, soldiers surged out of the dark. There was a short struggle. No shots were fired. The two men were bound, gagged, and forced to sit with their backs against stone. The lieutenant shone a flashlight over their faces and checked what had been taken. Cut-down British uniforms without divisional insignia, plastic explosives, precision detonators, a codebook. His first thought, reflexive and trained, was prisoner of war. They were captured, disarmed, and under guard. But a second word rose from the oral briefing he had heard months before, a word spoken without paper: commandos. He could not recite the clauses, but he remembered the core requirement with the dull pressure of a stone held inside the stomach. He ended the patrol at once. 4 soldiers were ordered to take the prisoners to an abandoned fisherman's hut and keep them under isolated guard. No one was to speak to them. No information was to be offered. The hut was not a prison and not a barracks. It was a holding place for a decision that would arrive from elsewhere. Then the lieutenant hurried to the company communications point and cranked the field telephone line to battalion. 2 suspected Allied commandos captured with sabotage equipment, he reported. Request instructions. There was a long pause on the line before the battalion commander answered. Hold them under strict guard. I am reporting it to regiment. Division should already know. Until there are explicit orders, do nothing, ask nothing. Hours passed under that instruction. Guards rotated. Boots scraped on the hut's floorboards. The lieutenant kept returning, not to interrogate, but to look, as if looking might become an excuse. The prisoners sat in silence. The lieutenant's men avoided their eyes. The word, do nothing, became heavier as time accumulated around it. Doing nothing, he realized, was not neutral. It was waiting for a different agency to arrive and take the decision away. The report moved by radio to division. An operations staff officer unfolded it on his desk. He did not have the full text of the high-level order, only a thin file of handwritten bullet points and official summaries kept for commanders. In a different war, the case would have been simple: capture, interrogation, registration, transport. Here the case was a test of classification, and classification was a decision hidden inside language. He read the facts: uniforms, sabotage mission, wireless set. This did not resemble the spearhead of a mass landing. It resembled the category the bullet points had been designed to catch. He drafted a request upward, using the language of recommendations and procedure that allowed an officer to hide inside form. 2 prisoners captured. Characteristics match commando pattern. Recommend handling under the October 18, 1942 principles, namely transfer to the relevant security service. He hesitated before writing the word recommend, then wrote it anyway, as if a softer verb could soften the result. The reply came back short. Approved. Security service reception coordinated. Prepare transfer. When the lieutenant on the coast received the instruction, he looked at the hut and said only, understood. The word was small, but it locked him into the chain. The next afternoon, a black Mercedes arrived, followed by a canvas-covered truck, grinding up the rutted road to the hut. A man in grey civilian clothes stepped out, leather gloves on his hands. Two companions followed, also in civilian dress, carrying submachine guns. The man produced a stamped document. Its unit abbreviation was one the lieutenant did not want to study too closely. His tone carried the calm of an administrative apparatus. "Under authorization," he said, "we are here to receive the personnel." He handed over a transfer form and pointed to the signature line. The lieutenant took the pen and asked once where they would be taken. The man looked at him without answering. He tapped the blank spaces for date and time with a gloved finger. The gesture was a refusal and a command at once. The army's business ended here. The lieutenant signed his name and rank. The act completed his part in the procedure and removed his burden of custody. Soldiers dragged the prisoners out of the hut. When the prisoners saw the black car and the civilians, they struggled, but they were shoved into the truck's rear compartment. The doors shut and were locked. The vehicles turned around and drove back down the road, raising dust that hung in the cold air. In the lieutenant's hand remained only a thin receipt, light as a scrap, with no details that could follow the men. He stood for a moment, feeling the emptiness of what he had just done, and then returned his men to their routine as if routine could erase the signature. In the army's files, the two names ended there. Nothing more was recorded because the order had been designed to ensure that nothing more would be recorded. A few days later, several kilometers inland at the edge of a secluded forest, a local logger who quietly carried messages for the resistance heard two short, muffled gunshots close together. From a slope, he saw civilians digging beneath pines. He did not approach. The next day, passing the place, he saw new earth scattered with needles, the surface already made to look ordinary. Two Allied names were later entered into a long list as missing on operations, presumed dead. They did not appear on any prisoner register. Such events did not remain confined to one coast. In Brittany, captured British Special Air Service soldiers were recorded as shot while attempting to escape. On an Aegean island, captured Greek saboteurs transferred to local security units were said to have vanished. Information arrived in fragments. A line from an internal German police report seized by partisans, a casual sentence in a soldier's letter home, an unmarked burial pit discovered by chance. Each piece, alone, could be dismissed as rumor. Together they began to outline something shaped like policy. In London, inside Combined Operations Headquarters, intelligence analysts began to mark those fragments on maps. Each report of capture without entry into any prisoner of war system became a dossier. Pins accumulated. Names appeared and then stopped appearing. The analysts learned to read absence as data. When a man was captured and yet never surfaced in the camp lists, that silence was evidence. A preliminary assessment memorandum was drafted and stamped top secret. Its title was long, its tone disciplined. Preliminary analysis of the German pattern of systematic, irregular disposition of captured special operations personnel. The memo did not pretend to omniscience. It listed what could be proved and what could only be inferred, yet its conclusion was hard enough to be felt through the cautious language. Available evidence strongly indicated that senior German authorities may have issued a directive intended to strip certain captured personnel of prisoner of war status and execute them. Only a few copies were made. They were routed upward, away from ordinary circulation, because even the suspicion of a policy could shape decisions about future raids and about how missing men should be understood. A death in battle was one kind of loss. Disappearance after capture was another, and it demanded a different response. The war ended. Captured officers were brought before courts where paper, at last, could be used against the machine that had worshipped paper. The trial began a few months after Anton Dostler was captured. The courtroom was an Italian town hall with a high ceiling that gave every cough an echo. Dostler, a former German army general, stood in an old uniform stripped of insignia, his back straight. He was charged with a crime committed in March 1944 in the hills near La Spezia, the execution of 15 captured American soldiers. The prosecutor did not build the case around rage. He built it around classification and obligation because that was how the crime had been committed. The Americans, he said, belonged to a regular commando unit tasked with sabotaging a railway tunnel. They wore U.S. uniforms. They carried identification tags. When captured in a firefight, they bore arms. Each detail mattered because each detail pointed to a rule that even war recognized. Uniformed combatants captured and disarmed were prisoners of war. To shoot them without trial was not a battlefield act. It was an administrative decision disguised as military necessity. Documents were introduced. A telegram from the capturing unit requested instructions. A divisional message forwarded it with a note. Refer to the principles of October 18, 1942. Then a third message appeared, enlarged for the court. It was brief, and it carried Dostler's authority. Approved. Execute according to the October 18, 1942 High Command Order. Dostler's signature sat on the page like a stamped seal. The paper itself was thin, but the decision it recorded had weight. Defense counsel argued superior orders. Dostler had received a mandatory directive from above, counsel said, and in wartime refusal meant court-martial or worse. Dostler himself repeated the same point on the stand. He was a soldier in a system, obligated to obey. He had no personal quarrel with the executed men. He had only followed a chain. On cross-examination, the prosecutor stepped away from abstractions and aimed at the moment of choice. "General," he said, "set aside for a moment whatever your army group may have told you. When you saw the request for approval and saw that it relied on a directive that demanded execution of captured soldiers, did you feel even a moment of doubt that it conflicted with the rules of war you knew?" Dostler answered that his duty was to recognize lawful authority, not to judge content. The prosecutor pressed again, narrowing the space until only the signature remained. "Did you add any note requiring verification? Did you instruct your subordinates to confirm uniforms and identity tags? Did you leave any record of an attempt to narrow the order's application or reduce harm? Even a sentence saying ensure the procedure is correct?" Dostler said no. The order was clear. He believed nothing additional was required. In closing, the prosecution cited Article 8 of the London Charter. Acting under superior orders does not remove responsibility, though it may mitigate punishment. The point was not to deny hierarchy's pressure. It was to insist that some commands are so plainly unlawful that they announce themselves, and that a senior officer with discretion cannot claim he was only a conduit when his signature authorizes death. A man who signs approved is not only transmitting, he is choosing. The verdict was read in a steady voice. Dostler was found guilty and sentenced to death. The court held that he had the capacity and the obligation to question a directive that plainly violated the basic laws of war, or at least to take steps to verify necessity. His signature was not mechanical transmission, it was personal authority exercised. News of the verdict traveled through camps holding other senior officers. Men who had once sat at desks, who had once spoken of necessity and procedure, read the lines about a general condemned and understood what had changed. A chain that had once pointed only downward, now pointed upward. In one such camp, a former staff officer who had once processed secret files read the brief notice about Dostler's sentence and handed it back as if it burned. He stared through the wire at a point in the distance and spoke so softly that the man beside him barely heard. The chain of accountability has become irreversible. It is pointing back towards the desk where the order was born. Nuremberg followed. In the great hall of the International Military Tribunal, the air felt dense, as if even light carried weight. The focus shifted from individual killings to the architecture that made them repeatable. Prosecutors pointed not to a trench impulse, but to a bureaucratized crime. Murder packaged as a directive and distributed through a hierarchy until it became routine. A clerk projected a document onto the screen. The heading identified the High Command. The date was October 18, 1942. The prosecutor let the title and date hang in silence before naming it, the Commando Order. He read key clauses. Kill to the last man. Immediate transfer to the security service. Not applicable to enemy troops captured in open, large-scale combat. Punishment for non-compliance. Hearing it aloud, in a hall built for law, stripped away any pretense that it was merely a rough instruction from a desperate front. The prosecutor's voice rose, not with emotion, but with precision. This document, he told the judges, was not drafted in a trench. It was born in an office in Berlin. It was typed, revised, stamped, sealed, and distributed. It was designed to operate without improvisation, to produce the same result wherever its input condition appeared. A war crime had been engineered as a repeatable routine. A second document appeared on the screen dated June 25, 1944. Another High Command memorandum addressing measures against sabotage and commando forces. It reminded commands to strictly carry out the October 18th order and to take decisive action against any persons deemed to fall under it. The prosecutor's point was simple and devastating. This was not a single aberration. It was a policy reaffirmed over time and kept alive when the war's pressure would have tempted hesitation. Former staff officers testified. They spoke of intelligence assessments, of threats to logistics, of necessity, of process. They insisted their duties lay in transmission and efficiency, and that legal questions belonged to legal departments. Under questioning, their language narrowed into the claim that made the machine run. If an order came from lawful authority and followed channels, it became part of the work. Personal doubts, they suggested, were irrelevant in a system built to move faster than conscience. One witness, asked directly whether the words "kill to the last man" had troubled him when he first saw them, paused long enough for the room to feel the pause. He then spoke of strategic necessity and execution efficiency, and of trust in authority. The prosecutor did not argue with the witness's description of fear and pressure. He argued with the conclusion. If fear and pressure could dissolve law, he said, then law existed only for peacetime ceremonies. War was precisely the time when law had to hold, or else it was not law at all. An eminent professor of international law from a neutral country testified as an expert. His tone was academic, the kind of calm that carries authority because it refuses theatrics. He explained the customary principle, long established, that lawful combatants who fall into an enemy's hands must be treated humanely and may not be executed without judicial process. They are, in the language of law, hors de combat. The prohibition against killing them is not conditional on whether they are liked or feared or politically convenient. Then he turned to the commando order and analyzed its clauses. The core directive required unconditional execution of a defined category. That, he said, was a direct violation of the absolute prohibition against killing those in custody. The exception clause could not rescue the illegality of the core directive. It instead revealed that the drafters knew they were tearing at the rules and tried to leave themselves a thin paper shield. The transfer clause, he added, was not a mere administrative step. It was the method by which the military washed its hands and delivered prisoners into a realm where records and courts did not follow. He pointed to the clause threatening punishment for non-compliance. This, he told the court, showed how the order coerced complicity. It used fear against the very officers expected to execute it. From the text alone, he concluded, the order was manifestly unlawful from the day it was issued. Any officer with basic training or ordinary moral sense should have recognized it. Military necessity could not justify it because the law of war exists precisely to balance necessity and humanity. This order refused that balance. In final argument, prosecutors braided intent, means, conduct, and result into a single chain. An unlawful order issued at the top, distributed and reaffirmed through bureaucracy, executed in the field, producing deaths that were foreseeable once the mechanism was set. The men who wrote and transmitted the clauses were not only messengers, they were designers of a procedure that turned human beings into an input and death into an output. Judgment came slower than in trials of single atrocities, and it landed heavier. The tribunal confirmed that the High Command had been used as an important instrument of aggressive war and that its leadership had formulated and issued multiple orders, among them the commando order that plainly violated the laws and customs of war. The court did not declare every member of the institution a criminal. It fixed responsibility where policy was made and transmitted with authority, where the decision to convert captives into exceptions had been signed, sealed, and enforced. Years later, far from Europe, cadets sat upright in a military academy lecture hall. The instructor teaching the law of armed conflict was a gray-haired former judicial advisor. On the screen, two documents appeared side by side, a summary of Article 8 of the London Charter and a photocopy of the Commando Order's first page. Nuremberg's contribution, the instructor said, was to state in law what war repeatedly tries to erase. Beneath the uniform, there is first a human being, and a human being bears a conscience obligation that cannot be surrendered. He pointed to the line about killing to the last man. This, he said, is the textbook example of a manifestly unlawful order. It is so clear that you do not need a doctorate in law to understand it. The Dostler case and the prosecution of the High Command prove that when such an order is executed, responsibility does not evaporate in the chain of command. He turned off the projector and let the room brighten. You will all become commanders, he told them. You will receive directives that are urgent, persuasive, and wrapped in authority. Your duty is not only to execute, it is to judge whether a directive will drag you and your soldiers into an abyss. Some lines do not fade because you wear a uniform. They become sharper because you hold command. Remember this order, he said. Remember the men who vanished because of it, and the men who were condemned for carrying it out. The instructor closed the syllabus with a soft slap and dismissed the cadets. Chairs scraped, boots moved toward the door. The room emptied, but the problem he had placed in front of them did not. The question inside the commando order was not only what an enemy deserved, it was what a commander becomes when he signs a form that turns a human being into an exception. Outside the hall, the academy grounds were quiet. Inside the dismissed lecture, a thin line had been drawn, not steel, not concrete, but rules that restrain the strong by protecting the weak. The instructor's point was simple and unforgiving. When a system calmly tears open that circle of protection and claims the exclusion is only for the most dangerous, the corrosion does not stop with the victim. It spreads into the executor, into the institution, and into the very language commanders use.